October 5th, 2018. It was an ordinary autumn evening in the quiet suburb of Evergreen Hills, Georgia. The sky was already cloaked in darkness, and a cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves. In the house at 17 Howard Street, a sound suddenly shattered the peaceful evening: a gunshot. Neighbors rushed outside, looking around in panic, and noticed anxious movement at the window of Draven Locke's home, where he lived with his wife, Zora Locke. No one knew what had happened at that moment, but soon everything would change. The police arrived at the scene just minutes after receiving the call. Officers entered the house and discovered a horrifying scene. Draven stood motionless in the middle of the living room, holding a revolver. In front of him, on the floor surrounded by scattered belongings, lay his wife, Zora. Her body was still, and a pool of blood was spreading across the wooden floor. Officers arrested Draven, who didn't resist. He just kept repeating one phrase over and over: "I didn't know. I didn't know." The neighbors, who had always considered the Lockes the perfect couple, were in shock. They couldn't understand how Draven, a quiet and intelligent man, could be at the center of such a horrific tragedy. To the residents of Evergreen Hills, the Locke family had always been a model of success and harmony. Draven Locke, a 38-year-old software developer, was well respected in his community. Tall, reserved, and always neatly dressed, he was seen as the epitome of reliability. Zora Locke, his 35-year-old wife, wasn't just beautiful. She was vibrant and well-liked for her social nature and ability to connect with everyone. Her constant smiles, stylish outfits, and impeccable manners left no doubt. She and Draven were the perfect dream couple. Every morning, they left their house together, saying goodbye at the doorstep before heading off to their separate daily activities. Neighbors often commented on how happy they seemed. "It was one of those relationships you wish you had," recalled one neighbor who lived across the street. However, beneath this facade, subtle but ominous cracks were beginning to appear. Zora was frequently away from home for extended periods, sometimes for days at a time. She explained it as work. Her consulting business required frequent trips, but her returns grew increasingly late, accompanied by an unspoken tension in the air. Draven seemed to ignore it, maintaining the appearance of a happy life. Close friends of the couple noticed that something had changed in recent months. "They didn't seem as close as they used to be," one of Draven's friends recalled. "She often looked downcast, and he seemed distant." These small details didn't seem alarming at first, but in light of the events that followed, they took on a whole new significance. What was hidden behind this facade? Was their marriage really as perfect as it seemed to everyone? A dark cloud of suspicion had been hanging over Draven for months. He knew something was wrong. Zora was becoming more distant. Her phone was always locked, and her trips suddenly started lasting longer than usual. Every time he tried to talk to her about it, she made excuses, dodging his questions. But one weekend, while staying home, Draven stumbled upon a clue that would change his life forever. It happened during a routine cleaning. He was sorting through their shared closet when a small black notebook, hidden behind Zora's clothes, caught his eye. He couldn't recall ever seeing this notebook before. Instinct told him it could be important, and he decided to open it. What he found inside shook him to his core. The notebook was a sort of meeting log. It listed dates, names, and places, hotel addresses, and private residences. Next to them were amounts of money: $500, $1,000, $1,500. Each entry was neat and precise. Draven couldn't believe his eyes. He flipped through the pages, and with each new revelation, his heart sank. It was clear. Zora wasn't just going on business meetings. She was leading a double life, hidden from everyone, including him. She was engaging in prostitution. Draven froze, holding the notebook in his hands. His worst suspicions had been confirmed. He felt betrayed, humiliated. But more than anything, he was consumed by rage. How long had this been going on? How many times had she lied to his face? She was his wife. They shared a life, a future. And now, everything he thought he knew about her was a lie. But instead of confronting her right away, Draven chose to keep his discovery to himself. He wasn't ready for a confrontation. Inside, a dark feeling began to grow, a mix of pain, anger, and despair. He installed spyware on her phone to monitor her messages and movements. For weeks, he tracked her every step, watching as his worst fears were confirmed. He saw her leave the house, supposedly for work, but in reality, meeting clients. Feeling trapped, Draven became increasingly withdrawn, brooding over his plans. It was hard for him to accept the truth about his wife, but with each passing day, the tension between them became unbearable. The more Draven watched Zora, the deeper he sank into the chaos of her secrets. But soon, he made another discovery that changed his perspective entirely. While carefully going through Zora's messages with one of her clients, he came across a series of texts from someone named Calix Whitley, a name that had appeared multiple times in her notebook and phone records. But these messages were not just business negotiations or arrangements for meetings. They were personal and threatening. Calix wasn't just a client. He was her former lover. What's more, Draven soon realized that Zora wasn't engaging in prostitution by choice. Calix had trapped her. Through blackmail and threats to expose her past, her financial troubles, and, worst of all, to destroy their marriage, Calix had kept her under his control. The messages made it clear. Zora had been trying to break free from this web, but Calix was pressuring her, threatening to reveal her secrets and tear apart their family if she stopped working for him. Draven was stunned. For months, he had believed his wife was betraying him out of greed or desire for money. But the truth was far darker and more complex. Zora wasn't guilty. She was a hostage to a situation she couldn't escape. Zora had been suffering, and Draven hadn't understood. He could have helped her if she had opened up to him, but perhaps out of shame and fear, she chose silence. He had seen her emotional state deteriorate day by day, watched her withdraw further, and now he knew why. But instead of feeling sympathy, Draven's rage only grew. He wasn't just a betrayed husband. He felt utterly forsaken. He had thought their relationship was built on trust, only to find out that his wife had been hiding a dark life from him the whole time. She hadn't trusted him enough to tell him the truth and ask for help. Calix became the focus of Draven's hatred. He saw him as the man who had ruined his life, but he also couldn't forgive Zora for allowing it to happen. In his mind, plans for revenge began to take shape, not just against Calix but against Zora herself. His anger festered, mingling with feelings of betrayal and powerlessness. Zora, unaware that Draven knew her secret, continued living her double life, sinking deeper into the grim web that Calix had spun. But the clock was ticking. Draven was on the edge of a breakdown. The longer Draven observed what was happening, the more he realized his reaction to the situation wasn't as simple as it seemed at first. He felt betrayed and crushed, but his anger was slowly turning into something darker, a burning hatred, not just toward Calix but also toward Zora herself. His world was falling apart, and he increasingly felt that control was slipping from his grasp. However, strangely enough, Draven wasn't entirely innocent in this tragedy either. It turned out that Draven had sensed something strange about Zora's behavior long before he found the notebook. He had suspected her of betrayal for a while, but instead of confronting her, he chose silence. Moreover, his business was on the verge of collapse. His startup wasn't bringing in the money he had expected, and hidden debts were piling up. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable, and Draven realized that without Zora's money, they could lose their home, their comfortable lifestyle, everything they had built together. When he found the notebook, instead of confronting Zora right away, he started developing a plan. He wanted to use her double life to his advantage. At first, he was willing to turn a blind eye to what she was doing because the money she was making could help him save his business and their family. The idea took root in his mind. He could let it continue until he regained control of his finances. But the longer he watched her actions, the deeper he sank into his dark thoughts. Each new meeting, each new message from Calix fueled his jealousy and hatred. He could no longer look at Zora the way he used to. The image of her in his mind became twisted, ruined. He saw her not just as a victim of Calix, but as someone who had knowingly betrayed his trust, even if her motives were more complicated than he had anticipated. At some point, his anger began to consume him. He couldn't forgive Zora for her silence. He couldn't forgive her for choosing this path without telling him. He began to feel that she had done it not only to save their family, but because she wanted to escape from him, their marriage, and her responsibilities. Draven continued to play the role of a good husband, never revealing his suspicions. But inside, everything was boiling. He started drinking more, becoming increasingly distant, but every time Zora tried to talk to him, he brushed her off or pretended that everything was fine. He didn't even try to find Calix because, in his eyes, Zora was the one who had allowed this to happen. To Draven, their marriage was already destroyed, and it didn't matter who was truly to blame, Calix or Zora. While Draven concealed his emotions and suspicions, the financial problems became increasingly palpable. His startup was on the verge of bankruptcy. Profits were dropping, investors were pulling out, and debts were mounting. Every day he faced the grim reality. Without an additional source of income, he and Zora risked losing their home, cars, and everything they had worked so hard to build. Each day was a battle to stay afloat, but now he saw no way out. Zora, despite her attempts to hide the truth, also felt the tension. She knew about Draven's financial troubles, but didn't realize just how bad things were. Calix, her blackmailer, continued to threaten her, demanding more of her time and money. Zora felt trapped. Her life had become an endless chain of compromises and deceit. She hoped that it would end one day, that she could break free, but each day pulled her deeper into the abyss. Draven, aware that Zora's money could save them, became increasingly financially dependent on her. Deep down, he knew where the money was coming from, but he forced himself to ignore that fact. The longer this went on, the more his anger and resentment ate away at him. He could no longer look at her without feeling humiliated, knowing that their life was being sustained by the money she earned through her secret life. Trying to cope with the pain and growing sense of powerlessness, Draven started drinking more. Alcohol dulled his emotions temporarily, but it only intensified his internal rage. He avoided conversations with Zora, retreating into himself and sinking further into dark thoughts. Time passed, and the money kept coming in, but it brought him neither relief nor satisfaction. Instead, each new transaction only deepened his feelings of guilt and hatred toward both himself and Zora. He became obsessed with the situation. In the evenings, when Zora left for her business meetings, he sat alone in their empty house, frozen in front of the computer, tracking her movements through the spyware he had installed. He knew where she was going and who she was meeting, but he did nothing. He felt his control over his life slipping away, which only fueled his frustration. The most devastating realization for Draven was that his pride had been shattered. He, a man who had always seen himself as successful and self-reliant, was now dependent on a wife whom he believed had betrayed him in the worst possible way. His business was collapsing, his marriage was falling apart, and his sense of dignity had vanished. It was all building up like an avalanche. In his mind, the only way out seemed to be a drastic measure. The financial crisis had become an emotional one, threatening to destroy everything. Meanwhile, Zora was struggling to deal with the blackmail, and thoughts of confessing everything to Draven began to form in her mind. She knew she could no longer keep living in fear and deceit, but she was terrified that he would never forgive her for allowing Calix to gain control. She knew she had ruined their marriage and hoped that maybe they could still fix things if she told him the truth. But she didn't know how far Draven had gone in his thoughts. October 5, 2018, became a turning point in the Locke family's life. That evening, everything was about to change, though neither Draven nor Zora could foresee how. Draven sat in the living room, sipping whiskey, replaying all the events of the past few months over and over in his mind. Zora, as usual, was late from her business meetings. He knew she was lying again, and the rage inside him was boiling. Meanwhile, Zora was on her way home, having decided that she could no longer live in constant fear and deceit. She was going to tell Draven everything. Calix continued to threaten her, and her conscience was tearing her apart. She realized that things couldn't go on like this. She needed to stop before it was too late. When she walked into the house, Draven was already waiting for her in the living room. The air was thick with tension, almost tangible. Zora noticed the way her husband was looking at her. His gaze was cold and piercing, filled with both hatred and pain. "Where have you been?" His voice was quiet, but a storm brewed beneath the surface. Zora froze, knowing that this was the moment she had feared. She could no longer lie. I have to tell you everything, she began, her voice trembling. It's complicated, but you need to know the truth. Draven didn't let her finish, interrupting her with barely contained fury. His hands gripped the whiskey glass so tightly it could have shattered. He jumped out of his chair, moving closer to her. The truth? The truth? He nearly shouted the word, his emotions no longer in check. You want to tell me the truth now? After all this time? After all your lies and betrayal? Zora took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to explain that she had been forced into it, that it was blackmail. But Draven wasn't listening. To him, everything was already clear. He had been betrayed in the worst way. I know everything, Zora, he continued, glaring at her with contempt. I know about your meetings, the money, all of it. You think I didn't figure it out? You think I've been a blind fool this whole time? Zora was stunned. She hadn't realized he knew about Calyx, about the blackmail, or about her secret life. Tears welled up in her eyes. She tried to move closer to him, to explain, but he recoiled sharply. You let this destroy us, Draven said, his voice now quiet, but in that quietness lay something terrifying. You sold our life, our marriage. And for what? For money? So I would be dependent on you. No, Zora tried to protest. It's not like that. I was trying to protect us. I did it for you. Her voice was shaking. She could barely speak. For me? Draven laughed, but it was a hollow, joyless sound. You betrayed me for me? He swung his arm out, sending the whiskey glass flying against the wall, where it shattered into hundreds of pieces. Zora recoiled in fear, her heart gripped by terror. She realized she had lost control of the situation, and that Draven was no longer the man she once knew. Suddenly, Draven lunged toward the table and grabbed the revolver he kept in the house for self-defense. His hands were shaking, but his face showed only grim, almost deranged determination. You think I can live with this? He shouted, aiming the gun at her. You think I can forgive you for all of this? Zora raised her hands in a gesture of peace, tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Draven, please, she whispered. We can fix this. I'll tell you everything. We just need to talk. But her words could no longer reach him. The rage that had been building inside him for months had finally taken over. He no longer saw the woman he had loved standing in front of him. All he saw was her betrayal, her lies. In that moment, everything in his mind flipped upside down. He squeezed the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence of the house, and Zora collapsed to the floor. Her eyes froze, her life gone in an instant. Draven stood motionless, realizing what had just happened. But it was already too late. After the roar of the gun faded, an eerie silence fell over the house. Only the sound of the revolver hitting the floor and Draven's breathing broke the dreadful stillness. He stood frozen, his gaze fixed on Zora's lifeless body. Time seemed to stop. Zora lay on the floor, her eyes open, but they no longer held life. Blood, slowly at first but then faster, spread across the cold floor, forming a crimson pool around her. Draven, still holding the revolver, stared at her, unable to comprehend what he had just done. Only one thought pulsed in his mind. Did this really happen? But even as he let go of the gun, which fell with a dull thud onto the floor, the reality of what had happened still hadn't fully sunk in. The revolver, which he had never intended to use, now symbolized his own ruined life. His breathing quickened, and his hands trembled. It felt as if the walls of the house were closing in on him, suffocating him. He took a step back, staring at his wife's body, but his legs felt rooted to the floor. He couldn't recall how the next few minutes passed. His thoughts were chaotic, but one realization slowly began to sink in. In the moment his finger pulled the trigger, he had not only taken his wife's life, he had killed his only chance for understanding and forgiveness. He had thought she had betrayed him, lied to him, and destroyed their marriage. But now, standing over her body, he began to remember her words. Her last words. She had been trying to tell him something. I was trying to protect us. I did it for you. Those words echoed in his mind. What had she meant? Draven, realizing what Zora had been trying to say, felt his heart tighten with horror. She hadn't just lied to him, hadn't betrayed him for money or her own amusement. She had been a victim of blackmail, of Calix, and of the circumstances that had cornered her. She had wanted to protect their marriage, their life, but she hadn't had any other choice. And now she was dead. Only now did Draven begin to grasp the full extent of his mistake. She had been about to tell him the truth. She had wanted to end this secret life, but he hadn't given her the chance. He had been so blinded by anger and pain that he couldn't hear her. In her final moments, Zora had tried to escape the web of lies, but Draven had destroyed that possibility with his own hands. He fell to his knees beside her body. Tears streamed down his face, but it was too late. No amount of tears, no apologies could bring Zora back. She was gone, and he had lost her forever. Draven felt broken. All those months he had spent consumed by anger and hatred now seemed foolish and meaningless. He had blamed her for everything but had failed to see her suffering. He had been incapable of understanding that she was a victim of a situation she couldn't escape. And now, he had paid the ultimate price, the loss of his wife. At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air. The neighbors, having heard the gunshot, had called the police. Draven didn't move. He didn't try to run or hide. He knew this was the end of everything he knew and loved. Officers burst into the house, but Draven offered no resistance. They found him kneeling before Zora's body, his eyes full of tears, but devoid of life. The police arrested Draven. He didn't say a word, only repeating to himself in a trance, "I didn't know. I didn't know." He had killed his wife without understanding the full truth, and now that truth would haunt him for the rest of his life. Draven was taken into custody without resistance. His face, wet with tears and empty of emotion, seemed unaware of what was happening around him. The officers led him out of the house, as horrified neighbors looked on. These were the same people who had once seen him as the perfect husband, a respectable man, but now they saw a broken man whose life had been destroyed in an instant. The house was cordoned off, and soon an official investigation began. Forensic experts quickly determined that Zora Locke had been shot at close range, leaving no doubt it was premeditated murder. But the police wanted to delve deeper into the details. As they began to explore the lives of Draven and Zora, unexpected facts emerged that shocked even the most seasoned detectives. During the investigation, the police found Zora's notebook, the one Draven had discovered weeks earlier. It became the starting point for uncovering her secret life. They also unearthed her correspondence with Calix Whitley, the man who had held her captive through blackmail. Calix was Zora's former lover, and his pressure and manipulation had forced her into prostitution to hide their shared secret. The police also discovered that the Locke's financial situation was far from stable. Draven, on the brink of bankruptcy, was fully aware that Zora's earnings were crucial to saving their well-being. While he knew his wife was earning money through illegal means, he allowed it to continue. This became a critical element in the investigation. The fact that Draven knew about her activities but didn't intervene until the situation spiraled out of control. The motive for the murder became clear. Detectives concluded that Draven had been consumed by jealousy, humiliation, and rage over her betrayal. He saw Zora as the one who had destroyed their marriage but had never fully realized that she was a victim of manipulation herself. Her secret life had not been by choice. It had been forced upon her. The trial attracted widespread public attention. News of the perfect couple from the suburbs whose lives had ended in such a tragic way spread across the country. The media covered every detail. Zora was portrayed as a woman trapped in a web of manipulation and blackmail, while Draven was seen as a man whose anger led him to make a fatal mistake. At the trial, the prosecution argued that Draven had committed the murder in a fit of rage. They portrayed him as a man who couldn't cope with feelings of betrayal and humiliation. The defense, however, argued that Draven had been emotionally crushed and that his actions were driven by the intense stress of financial struggles and personal upheaval. Draven confessed to the murder but claimed that he hadn't understood the full truth. His attorneys tried to frame it as a crime of passion, emphasizing that he felt deeply betrayed and hurt but had been unable to see that Zora herself was a victim of blackmail. After weeks of hearings and countless testimonies, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Draven was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The decision sparked mixed reactions from the public. Many felt that his sentence was too lenient, while others saw him as a victim of circumstances and emotional turmoil. When the sentence was handed down, Draven stood in the courtroom looking broken but offered no resistance. He accepted his fate, knowing that no punishment could bring Zora back or undo what he had done. For him, the sentence wasn't just a consequence for her death. It was a reckoning for his own blindness and inability to understand her suffering. After the verdict, Draven Locke was transferred to a correctional facility, where his new life, behind bars, began. For him, it wasn't just a prison sentence. It was a constant reminder of his crime, a haunting memory of the night he took his wife's life without understanding the full truth. Every day in prison became a reflection of his inner emptiness. Draven withdrew into himself, refusing to interact with other inmates and practically ignoring the world beyond his thoughts. He replayed that fateful night over and over in his mind, wondering what he could have done differently, how he could have saved their relationship if only he had listened, given her a chance to explain. But each time, his thoughts led him to the same conclusion: it was too late. However, prison is not only a punishment, it is also time for reflection. Over the course of a year spent in solitary contemplation, Draven began to realize his role in the collapse of their marriage. Zora hadn't been the only one hiding the truth. He, too, had ignored all the signs that pointed to her needing help. He had used her, trapped in his own pride and anger. This realization was a heavy blow, but perhaps it was the first step toward accepting his guilt. Outside the prison, life moved on. Zora's family, her close friends, tried to come to terms with her death. But no matter how hard they tried, the tragedy remained a wound that would not heal. It especially affected her younger sister, Iris, who now took on the responsibility of raising their children. The Locke's two children, Kieran and Layla, found themselves at the center of public sympathy. Iris did everything she could to shield them from the media and the attention of strangers, trying to create a stable life for them under the new circumstances. They were still too young to fully understand what had happened, but one day they would have to learn the full truth. Every year, Iris held a small memorial service in honor of her late sister. Friends and family would gather at a small park near the home where Zora and Draven had lived their last happy years. Despite the pain, Iris wanted to preserve the memory of their mother as she had been before their lives turned into a nightmare. She was a wonderful mother, strong and loving, she would say, holding photographs of her sister, carefully avoiding mention of the tragic final months of her life. Draven had no contact with Zora's family. He understood that, to them, he was a symbol of destruction and tragedy, and he did not seek forgiveness. In his mind, he felt undeserving of redemption or forgiveness. He believed his true punishment was living with the knowledge of what he had done. Haunted by the memory of the night, his anger led to irreversible consequences. However, a few years into his prison sentence, Draven unexpectedly received a letter. It was from Iris. In her letter, she didn't express hatred or a desire for revenge for her sister's death. Instead, she wrote about how difficult it had been to care for the children, how they asked about their mother, and how they were gradually starting to learn the truth. The letter was short, but there was something more in it, a tentative attempt at reconciliation with the past. For Draven, the letter was like a glimmer of light, but he didn't respond. He didn't know what he could say in return, but he knew one thing. His life had changed forever, and the price of it was far too high.